My dear students, in this class, let us learn about genetic drift. The learning objectives behind this lesson is in this class, we are going to learn about the definition of genetic drift and the scientist who has proposed this concept of genetic drift and in which populations, that means whether in small population or in big population this genetic drift takes place. That means in which type of populations this genetic drift occurs. And at the end, we're also going to learn about the effect and outcome of the genetic drift. Genetic drift is a selective force in the process of evolution. But there is a slight difference between natural selection and genetic drift. In natural selection, favorable characters are selected and unfavorable characters are eliminated. Whereas genetic drift doesn't differentiate between favorable and unfavorable characters. And natural selection operates with a set motive, whereas the genetic drift occurs only by chance. Genetic drift was proposed by G.L.N. Hence, it is also called G.L.N effect. Genetic drift is defined as the change in gene frequency that is purely brought about by chance. The gene frequency is changed either to 1 or to 0. That means a particular gene may get established within the population or it may get eliminated within the population. That means fixation of certain characters or elimination of certain characters are facilitated by this genetic drift. And this always occurs in small populations because big population is a very vast unit to identify the changes. For example, big populations are comparable to oceans. To the ocean, if you add a drop of water, the change that is brought about by the drop of water in the ocean is not at perceptible level. Whereas the small populations are comparable to a very minute units. So small change will also leave a perceptible change in the small populations. So the genetic drift occurs only in small populations but not in the big populations. Small populations are represented by the living organisms or colonies of living organisms that are inhabiting a group of islands, that means oceanic islands, or in a small area. So, genetic drift occurs purely by chance. It was discovered by G.L.N. Hence, it is called G.L.N effect, and it always occurs within small populations. And it is undoubtedly evolutionary force, just like natural selection. It is undoubtedly a driving force, just like a natural selection. But natural selection differentiates between favorable and unfavorable characters, whereas such a differentiation is not exhibited by the genetic drift. It doesn't care whether a character is useful or harmful. The frequency of some genes may be reduced in genetic drift, or some genes may be totally eliminated from the population. And as I already told, it doesn't differentiate between favorable and unfavorable combinations. And in this concept, in this aspect, the genetic drift is exactly antithesis to natural selection. And surprisingly, the heterozygous combinations may be changed to homozygous combinations in genetic drift. This is an important characteristic feature of genetic drift. Heterozygous combinations will be gradually transformed to homozygous combinations. That means heterozygous individuals are gradually replaced by homozygous individuals. This is the logical conclusion of the genetic drift. And origin of new species, of course, is the ultimate result of genetic drift. Because variation is the raw material for evolution, when heterozygous populations are gradually converted into homozygous population, there will be some sort of perceptible change that occurs in the population. As a result, these changes get accumulated in the form of variations and resulting in the formation of new species. So, just like natural selection, genetic drift is also an important driving force in the origin of new species. Small and isolated populations are the prerequisite for rapid evolution. Small population is the unit and it should be in an isolated condition. I will give the example of red Indians in subsequent slides, of course. Here you remember that small and isolated populations are the prerequisites for rapid evolution, and in this small and isolated populations only the genetic drift occurs. Fixation of a particular character or loss of particular character takes place due to genetic drift. Fixation of gene or loss of gene depends on the size of the population. If a small group of individuals from a population start a new colony in an isolated region, these individuals are called founders. Founders are nothing but a small group of individuals who got separated from the parent population. And allelic frequencies of their descendants, that means allelic frequencies of the descendants of founders, will be similar to founders rather than their ancestors. Founders are the individuals that are separated, that got separated from the parental population. But the progeny of the founders resemble the founders, that means immediate parents, rather than the original parental population. Presence of O positive group in all red Indians is the best example for this founder principle. Founder principle is an important concept that supports the theory of genetic drift. And bottleneck effect is another evidence for genetic drift. Bottleneck effect is caused by natural calamities like tsunamis, earthquakes, pandemic breakdown, like that. And due to these natural calamities, many organisms will simply die. For example, in this COVID pandemic breakdown, the individuals with greater immunity will survive and the individuals with less immunity will die. That means these are called survivors, of course. And these survivors got separated and they form a group, and the progeny of these survivors are different from the original populations in their genetic makeup. For this, the best example is polydactylic dwarf individuals in old order Amish populations. I will give examples of small populations. And small populations, as I already told, are represented by the populations inhabiting the oceanic islands, isolated communities, small breeding populations, home range, territoriality of the animals. All these factors are responsible for the formation of small populations. Bottleneck effect is nothing but the natural calamity. The term bottleneck effect was coined by Stubbins. And I will give one example for the small populations. Lemmings represent a small rodent population in Scandinavian mountains. Genetic drift has no adaptive value. This was made clear already by me because the genetic drift doesn't differentiate between favorable and unfavorable characters. It doesn't have any adaptive value. Entire population may be filled with homozygosity due to genetic drift, and genetic drift undoubtedly upsets Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium. Unless the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium is upset, evolution doesn't take place. So, by upsetting the Hardy-Weinberg equilibrium, the genetic drift acts like a driving force for evolution. So, this is about the concept of genetic drift. Thank you very much.